Good morning and welcome to Campfire Sunday. I hope you all had a peaceful night's sleep. I was delighted to put the finishing touches to the weekend programme a month or so ago. My friend Kath over there sent me some ideas for the final part of the jigsaw, the Sunday keynote speaker. And I only had to look at a couple of YouTube videos to realise that she's completely in tune with what I've been thinking about, the directions for Campfire and her messages. And I'm absolutely delighted that she immediately agreed to come and talk to us. So I'd like you to give a really warm welcome to Scilla Elworthy.
Well, I was thrilled when I heard what Pete was intending to do, and I'm thrilled to be here. And wasn't that a wonderful evening last night? Oh, Edward II. So, what I want to talk about this morning is, are today's crises an opportunity for evolution of the human race? Just a small subject. Our current assumption is that the threats we face can best be met by weaponry and force. The current reality is that the real threats we face, terrorism, global warming, migration, the rich-poor gap, don't respond to force. So in this space, humanity has the opportunity to develop more intelligent methods of addressing the threats that we do now face. Einstein, as you remember, said, "No problem can be resolved from the consciousness that created it." How is humanity making this required leap in consciousness? I think it's an opportunity that we haven't had probably ever before in human history. So this may be a bit intense after a good night, but if not now, when? And if not us, who? In this amazing, safe space where nobody will shoot at us for saying what we really believe. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what drove me to do the work I've been doing since 1982. And it was basically fear and anger that first drove me. And I was right to be afraid, because in 1983, we were actually 20 minutes away from full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the then Soviet Union. I can enlarge on that if anybody's got questions about it, how it actually didn't happen. But I was working in the United Nations, and there was a conference on nuclear disarmament, and it was going nowhere after 2 weeks. And 1 million people gathered in the streets of New York. And I went down to see what was happening. And by the end of the day, which was totally peaceful, there were 1 million people in Central Park. The cops were leaning back against the brownstones with peace badges down their ties. And I thought, this will change everything, because you can't get more than 1 million people into the streets of New York. The New York Times gave it 5 pages the next day, and I went waltzing back into the UN thinking, this will change the whole thing. Not one country changed its position by half a centimetre. And I was strap hanging on a tram on Broadway, desolate that evening, when suddenly this thing hit me. We're talking or shouting at the wrong people. People in the UN don't have the power to do this. So I thought, who does have the power to change this? And it was obvious, really. It was the people making the warheads, the people designing the missiles, the people making money out of the missiles. It was people designing the strategy, working out the intelligence that warranted new weapons, and it was people doing the deployment and the targeting. So I thought, surely it must be possible to find out who they are. So I packed up my job, went home, and started a research group round my kitchen table. And all best research groups start out around somebody's kitchen table. So I had two people who knew no more than I did about any of this. One was a one-eyed silversmith, and the other was a teacher of French at the local secondary school. And we just started out. And to cut a long story short, after 4 years, we published our first book, which was called How Nuclear Weapons Decisions Are Made. And it had wiring diagrams, you know, those diagrams that show you who's connected to who and who influences who, for Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union, and America. And it actually showed who was doing what. Later, when I was visiting people, very senior officials in ministries of defense, I found this book in their shelves, heavily thumbed with pages marked, because they didn't know what, somehow or another we'd been able to find out. Anyway, what I want to do this morning is take, I should just add that in 1988, we published our fourth book, I think it was. And we were always funded by Quaker charitable trusts to do this work. They're amazing people. And in 1988, we published a who's who of nuclear weapons policy makers worldwide, with 650 biographies, names, addresses, and telephone numbers. And interestingly, out of 655 were women. And I went to interview them, and they had so absorbed the culture that they were thinking exactly like their male counterparts. And then for my doctorate, I went to interview in depth another 13 people, really to find out how they thought. And I drew cognitive maps of their thinking processes, and then went back and showed them afterwards that the sink, that's where all your thought ideas come from, in 12 out of 13 cases was the threat. 12 out of 13 of them were doing what they did because they felt threatened. So that's why I'm talking about threat this morning. So what I want to do, if you're with me, and do by all means, if you've got a question while I'm speaking, just go to the microphone and we'll stop and hear what you've got to say, and then we'll hopefully make room for questions at the end. So I want to take a real hard look at what we're up against in detail, because I've spent 3 or 4 decades in the peace movement, and we spend an awful lot of time talking to ourselves. And I want to really get clear about what we're up against. Secondly, what can be done to dismantle the military-industrial complex that drives wars? Thirdly, what would be a business plan for peace? And fourthly, who could do it? And lastly, what skills would they need? And this is where we come back to you and me. So my first part is, why does war continue? Very obvious reasons. Governments lie to their people about why they will go to war and what's happening during war. We know that very clearly from the Chilcot Inquiry. Secondly, war makes a few people extremely rich and serves the interests not only of arms traders, but traffickers, producers, and some politicians. The global military expenditure, now prepare for a lot of noughts, the global military expenditure in 2015 was $1,676 billion. Just to put that in context, the World Beyond War says that 30 billion per annum is needed to end starvation globally, and 11 billion per annum would provide clean water for everyone in the world. That's 11 billion out of 1,676 billion. The UK, as part of this, Our global arms trade in 2013 was 76 billion, the world's largest military exporters after the US. We're always between second and third, sometimes fourth. The taxpayer is propping up this industry with 700 million of subsidies, while the ingenuity of the engineers working for British Aerospace or any of the main shipbuilding companies building the submarines could turn the UK into a world leader in green technology. So, the global arms trade fuels war remains secret and totally unregulated. Fourthly, the war on terror, which is an abject failure on all counts, continues unquestioned. Decisions are made by those sharing similar values. I spend quite a lot of time talking to the people who make these decisions, and they share this set of assumptions, which is really hard to enter into, to get into a dialogue with them. And I'll come back to talking about how that's done in a minute, because what we ended up doing in the end of the 80s and all through the 90s was actually bringing individual policymakers from Britain, France, China. We even went to China with 4 different delegations to talk to their opposite numbers in those countries and to include those who had been in the business and got out of it. In other words, Frank Barnaby, who'd been a warhead designer at Aldermaston and gravitated to be the head of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute because he realized what was happening. So we brought in those who were very well informed and created an atmosphere where dialogue could take place. And it all had to happen completely under the radar because they wouldn't have come if there'd been any press release, there was no communique, there was nothing. So you never heard about it. But that was what we were up to all during the late 80s and the whole of the 90s. And in fact, right through up to now, when we've been, the Oxford Research Group, which is what I started, has been behind the Iran-US nuclear deal. But we just keep a very, very low profile so that you just don't take credit for things like that. Anyway, I want to read you as an antidote to all this what the Dalai Lama says, because I think it's a brilliant quote. And it's in something called The Reality of War. He says, of course, war and large military establishments are the greatest sources of violence in the world. These vast, powerful organizations exist solely to kill human beings. We should think carefully about the reality of war. Most of us are conditioned to regard military combat, and this wouldn't probably include most of us here, most of us are conditioned to regard military combat as exciting and glamorous, an opportunity for men to prove their competence and courage. Since armies are legal, we feel that war is acceptable. In general, nobody feels that accepting war is a criminal attitude. In fact, he says, we've been brainwashed. War is neither glamorous, these are his words, nor attractive. It is monstrous. Its very nature is of tragedy and suffering. And that's beginning to become real for a lot more people since what we've seen happening in Syria. So, and go on to why is it in our interests to stop war? War creates long-term problems, centuries of revenge. Revenge is still being taken in the Islamic world for things that happened in the 14th century. Terrorism, floods of refugees, children maimed for life, as we heard so poignantly yesterday. War costs a fortune, while building peace is extremely cost-effective and yet totally underfunded. I got very interested about 5 years ago in what the international community, so-called, spends on preventing war as against fighting war. And the sums came out this is 5 years ago. I've got to do it again for this study. But it came out that for every $1 that is spent on preventing war, $1,885 are spent on fighting war. And the organisation has started after Oxford Research Group, which is called Peace Direct, concentrates on the people who are actually preventing war. Now, I'm going to talk about some of those in a minute. Thirdly, the money saved from war can save people, as I've said, food, clean water, safety, refuge. Fourthly, militarism can't address these future threats that I've talked about: climate change, cyber attacks, migration, water shortage. And global inequality is growing so fast that it will fuel further terror groups and revolutionary movements. If you look at the literature on terror groups, one of the things that they quote most often is the gap between the consumerism of the United States and the West and people who are on the breadline. As you know, 62 billionaires in the world now have more wealth than half of the world's population. 62 billionaires. And that's shortly going to fall to 40 billionaires. Having more is obscene. So, how might war be stopped? This is where it gets interesting. 3 things have to happen. First of all, we have to understand how those in power think. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But it's if you want to engage with this subject, it's really important to understand how the people doing it think, and to do that without too much fury. When I first started to talk to nuclear weapons decision makers, I was so angry. I was angry at the fact of not just the risk of total nuclear annihilation, but I was really angry about the toxic nuclear materials that were being spread without care in different parts of the world. And what I found was that what I had to learn to do was really to listen to what they thought and what they were saying, and then repeat it back to them before I could ask them to do the same for what I wanted to say. So I would say to them, explain to me how you think. And they would do that, and I would read it back to them. And then I would say, oh, thank you. Now, can I tell you what I think? Because I can't expect somebody else to listen to me if I'm not willing to listen to them. And this applies whether it's Saddam Hussein. It doesn't matter. Secondly, what we need is a clear and powerful and persuasive business plan for peace, so that people can envisage a different future. And I want to really cost this. I'm not quite sure I'm going to do it because I'm not an economist, but I'll tell you what I think it contains. Firstly, a system that effectively prevents conflict and builds peace at local levels. I'm going to do local, national, and then international. So local. The first thing we've got to do is support locally led civilian initiatives for peace. Now, we've been able to trace, when we first started doing this work in 2001, we were able to find 300 effective locally led initiatives for peace, and Claire, who's sitting there, was part of that. And of those, we filtered out the 50 most fascinating, the ones that had saved the most lives, and wrote them up in a book called War Prevention Works, which is unfortunately out of print at the moment. But I want to tell you about one of the people we picked up then, and I'll tell you what she's gone on to do. Gululai Ismail in northwestern Pakistan, which is probably, the Swat Valley is one of the most dangerous places to be a woman today. And Gululai, when she was 15, started Aware Girls to get girls into school. Her colleague, Malala Yousafzai, got shot in the head for doing that. Gululai doesn't have any fear, or she never shows it. What she's doing now, age 26, is she's trained 223 youth activists to go into the madrasas where young men are being trained to be jihadis. They go home with these young men to their families and talk about why the Quran would not want them to be suicide bombers. And it chokes me up because they've actually dissuaded 250 suicide bombers from blowing themselves up. I'll tell her about your reaction because, you know, when you're working as far away from everything as that, you don't know that anybody even notices. So what I really encourage people to do is send a postcard to Gululai at the address of Peace Direct that you can find on the web, and they will take it to her. She gets so much encouragement from just a few words that people know about what's happening. Secondly, breaking the cycle of violence. Now, here I would like to tell you about my dear colleague, Henri Bourayaladi, who works in the middle of the Congo. He was a child soldier, and he managed to escape. And he decided to devote the rest of his life to trying to get kids away from the militias where they were kidnapped. And so what he does now, when we send him, say, we send very small amounts of money, like $100, he will get on his motorbike, ride into the bush, and buy a herd of goats. And he'll herd the goats to where the militia are hiding. And that in itself takes his life in his hands because militias are high on drugs, they don't like intruders, and they're trigger happy. But Henri knows how to talk to them. He trades one goat, priced $5, for one child, and brings the kids back to their families. And that's when the hard work begins, because these kids have been so brutalized. They've been taught to kill their own families. They're often made to shoot their parents. So these kids are in a horrific state, and their communities won't accept them back because they see them as monsters. So what Henri does is to organize road building programs right near their villages, where for 2 or 3 years the locals can see them building roads. It also gives them a bit of a job, and it means that after 2 or 3 years they can be reintegrated. Nobody knows about this. Well, actually, we did get the BBC to go out and film them, but that kind of coverage gives them safety, because the more they're known about in the West, the less likely they are to be assassinated. And then lastly, coming closer to home, you probably know about Jo Berry. Her dad was killed in the Brighton bombing. And she went and found the man who planted the Brighton bomb, Patrick McGee, when he came out of jail in the Good Friday Agreement. And she made friends with him. She sat down and listened to him and talked to him. They were both very resistant at the beginning, but she ended up understanding what had driven him. And they've become firm friends, and they now campaign together for breaking the cycles of violence in Northern Ireland. So now I'll go on to what are the systems for preventing conflict at national and regional levels. First of all, I would like 10 governments to build national infrastructures for peace. This is what Mandela set up in South Africa when he came out of jail and in the intervening period before he was elected president. He said he was highly aware of the danger of civil war, and I lived in South Africa for 10 years, and I was too. And basically what Mandela said is, we need a systematic way of stopping violence before it blows up. And so he organized a national peace council, city peace councils, regional peace councils, and local peace councils. And on each of those councils were people like you, people who were respected for their honesty, who were thoughtful about these issues, who had good ideas, and who could be given some money, not much, to put them into action. So every town and village had to develop a peace plan for when violence broke out. So, for example, when there was necklacing in the townships, you know what necklacing is? You put a car tire around somebody's neck who you don't like, put petrol in it and light it. And that was happening a lot in the townships. And they figured out a way to get in there and stop people doing that. So it's those methodologies, those infrastructures for peace, that Kenya is now trying out and Ghana. They've both passed legislation for it. This is to make sure that war doesn't escalate before it starts. It's the most sensible preventive measure. And when it comes to costing, guess what it costs? $2 million is all it costs to set it up in a country as big as Ghana. $2 million. That's to set up the machinery, train the people and get the thing going. And then it probably costs another $1 million a year to keep it going. But it's nothing compared to what war would do to that country. It's idiotic that we don't do it everywhere. Secondly, enable qualified women to fill policymaking roles on peace and security. Now, as you probably know, only 2.5% of those who sit around peace negotiating tables are women, which means that 50% of those who are injured in war or raped or made orphans are not, their interests are not represented at the peace table. So we have to change that. And there's people doing, there's something called Women Waging Peace in the States that's trained 1,000 women for leadership roles in 30 countries. Train and reward teams to negotiate the safe removal of dictators. Now, you might not think that's possible, so ask Lema Gbawi in Liberia what she did. Has anybody seen the film called Pray the Devil Back to Hell? Got to see it. It's these women got really fed up with the civil war that was going on in Liberia. The leaders of Liberia were in Sierra Leone, for some reason, negotiating peace. And they'd been there for 6 weeks, and nothing had happened, because they were really enjoying being in a hotel, having lots of food and wine, and not achieving anything. So the women went there from Liberia to Sierra Leone, long way, and surrounded the building. And they wouldn't let the men out until they negotiated a peace agreement. They even got the people who were guarding the building on their side to shut the windows. People were trying to jump out the windows, and the women just held their strength around this building. And it took another day, and they fixed a peace agreement. That's what they got the Nobel Prize for. Revamp national budgets for the prevention of conflict. Set up, I could go on for hours on this, but these are the kind of things that I'm going to cost for this this costed business plan for peace. We need to get business-like about this. And I think, probably with the genius of some people who I haven't yet met, there must be ways to make a lot of money in some way out of building peace. I don't know yet what it is, but somebody does. And then, obviously, we've got to work at international levels. That means early warning systems that actually work, early intervention internationally. And here I'd like to just tell you what Mandela did. When he was asked to negotiate peace in Burundi to stop, hopefully to stop happening what had been happening in Rwanda, he said, there's no point in having a peace negotiation unless we get everybody around the table. And that means the traffickers, the people who are dealing in illicit diamonds, it means all the people who've got a vested interest in this conflict going on. We need to get them around the table. And he went to talk to those people individually before getting them to join the negotiations. And that's the secret. Because if you just bring people raw round a table, they're there to defend their constituency and defend their point of view and speak up for those who are behind them. But what you need to do is hear them, really listen to them for hours and hours before. That's what Senator Mitchell did in Northern Ireland. He said, I will listen for as long as it takes. So, I want to come to the third bit before I must shut up. And that's a nationwide and possibly global alliance of people, now we're talking about us, from all walks of life, who are prepared to invest their time and their skills in making this plan, this business plan, a reality. So attempts to stop war from the top down often fail because of the mindsets of those that are filtered to the top by our current system. The people who end up in positions of power in our current system tend to be highly competitive, very argumentative, and invested in systems of oppression. So what we need to do is, again, I'll cover it as fast as I can, but here's what we can do, first of all, at local levels. In your school or community or workplace, you can make known the shock statistics, the kind of thing we're beginning to be able to recite now, that like the 62 billionaires that I told you about. We need to start reciting those statistics with everybody we talk to. Puncture alarmist rhetoric with facts, because people are very busy getting scared about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and that's exactly what they want. The more we can be afraid, the more they like it. So what we have to do is to shut down, I call it asphyxiating terror, get the media not to put their pictures on the front page. Build up a campaign to say, this is not the way to treat terror. If we want to minimize terror, we have to shut down the air time that it gets. I would suggest boycotting rich lists and celebrity rubbish with replacing it with noble lists. People have done really good things. Responsible CEOs, people who are transformers, get them profiled. Insist on making known the achievements of people who are doing what you're doing here. Celebrate those who prevent armed conflict. Make them heroes. The people I've described. Send them messages of support. And then break any cycle of violence in your own family or community. Start where the violence is by opening dialogue. Use NVC. Does everybody know what NVC is? Non-violent communication. It's very easy to learn. You can Google it, do a course for 2 days, and you'll come out competent in using non-violent language, whatever situation you're in. It's extraordinary talent to have. Then support alliances of cities that are standing for peace values. Find out if your own city nearby is actually standing for peace values. Replace your own aggressive values that you may have with nurturing values. And then address the persistent and long-term influence and effects of trauma by doing what we heard so eloquently yesterday, helping and assisting refugees, and even making friends with veterans suffering from PTSD. It's one of the saddest things is the number of suicides of people who, do you know there were more suicides in American soldiers than there were deaths of American soldiers in Iraq. More suicide post the war. So quickly, at national levels, campaign for your government to build a national infrastructure for peace. What would it look like if we had one here? Organize massive global online support for politicians who take a stand. Now, here I'm talking about people like, obviously, Caroline Lucas, Angela Merkel. She's one of my heroines. She's made lots of mistakes, but what she did on the subject of refugees was incredibly brave, and she's taken so much flack for it. And then there's a woman called Margot Wallström, the foreign minister of Sweden, who refused to give licenses for Swedish arms firms to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. And those people need encouragement. They're out there, sticking out their necks, and we need to let them know that we support them. And you can just send a message to the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and say, good, we like it. And that makes a difference. Contact and support indigenous groups. You know, indigenous groups have got the wisdom of generations and generations. And what they say is that no political decision should be made without examining how it will affect 7 generations in the future. So we've started something called the Regeneration Generation, which is getting 2 millennials, 1 male and 1 female, onto the board of all major corporations. It's going to take us a while, but they are there, they would be there to represent the interests of future generations. Yeah, you're right. And then draw up a list of qualified women that you know who could fill policy-making roles on peace and security in your country. And insist on a revamp of your national budget for the prevention of conflict, and so on and so on. So I think I'm getting soon out of time, and also I want to leave a bit of time for us here. But I want to just finish by saying this is all about us personally. It's all about the quality of people doing this work and the skills needed. And that means often changing our own inner landscape. Why do people become apathetic? People say, oh, it's too much, I don't have a big enough interest in these awful news bulletins. I can't deal with these feelings. Helplessness puts people into the old, primitive reptilian brain, the fight or flight. Now is the time for us to move constantly into the compassionate brain, which is the conscious brain, that can enable us to get into action. Somebody said to me the other day, when meaning goes, people get lost. So when meaning comes back into people's lives, then they can get into action. When they have something to live for that gives them not just hope, but a practical application of their skills. So that means to me 2 things. First of all, to say, the first thing I would say, if you wanted to get into action, I'd say, what breaks your heart? It might be animals, it might be children, it might be suicides, it might be whatever it is. Find out what breaks your heart. And then secondly, look at your skills. Are you a music maker? Are you an organizer? Are you a speaker? Are you a writer? Are you a painter? And apply those skills to what breaks your heart. That's where your energy will come. So I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're making me blush. We do have time for a few questions if anybody's got one burning. Otherwise, I bet. Yes, go for it. Yes. Anybody else want to ask a question? Yes, sir.
Hello.
At the microphone.
Okay. Thank you. That was an amazing speech. A couple of observations, maybe a bit skeptical. But you were saying about was it Sweden who stopped selling arms to Saudi Arabia?
Yep.
it's a step in the right direction, but when Western countries are still selling arms to Israel, I think it's not really, it's not really making much impact or difference. And as well, you were saying about ISIS and the fear of terrorists. I think the biggest fear should be of why are they terrorists?
Yeah.
What's happening? So the cause of the whole conflict. I think your plan and the structure is good and it could work, but whilst there's still wars going on and foreign interventions, civil wars caused by oil tycoons and stuff like that, I don't think there's a feasible or practical way of kind of getting there yet.
I agree. But hang on a second. The wars may still go on, but if we can get a better understanding of not just the motivations, but the money people are making out of war, and really start to zero in on that, because it's not just the zillions, trillions that I quoted for the official figures of arms trading, it's all the people making money on the side. And if we can start to analyze that, I'm not saying we're going to solve anything in 5 minutes. This will take 100 years, I reckon. But when we've got a global, national and local plan working at all those levels, where all kinds of people with all kinds of skills can get involved, then it begins to get interesting. And I would love to talk to you more about how you think we could do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, when my very good friend there was explaining what he was explaining, I'll just say one thing, if you've got a 1,000-mile walk to do, it always starts with one step. Now, we've all heard that before, and this will not be solved, what we're talking here today will not be solved in our generation, my children's generation, but so long as we keep walking on that 1,000-mile walk, I believe, and I think you believe, and you certainly explain well, that we will eventually one day achieve it by removing the fear of terror and the globalization of greed. So I thought I'd just come back when I heard it, yeah.
But you showed that yesterday. I was really moved by that whole panel session. It was brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to really thank you for your remarks. I think one interesting thing to do with the figures is, sorry, I just get away from this. Can people still hear me? Right. One interesting thing you can do with the figures is you have these massive figures, but then to break it down into individually, and again, this of course comes from a basic income perspective, but individually, how much would people, if that money had been spent on just giving people money, what would it be? And at one point, I sat down and worked out for the 7 countries most affected by the current wars in the Middle East, that if the U.S. or the powers that be had had actually spent that money on just giving people, had spent that on just giving people money, it would have been something like $280 a month for every man, woman, and child in those countries that are affected by the war. And if you just think of that and what a different world it would be now, okay, if they had just spent the money that way. I think that's another thing. I just wanted to make one other point, and that is that I think it's really, really important. I've really liked your approach because I think it's very important to look at the people who are making these decisions and involved in the trade as individuals and with their own individual take on things. And yes, there is a kind of common thing that they do, but it is possible to pick off. And I have that just because I come from a military background, and you see the kind of differences that there are actual people there. I think there's a way that we on the left or we in the peace movement, tend to think of it as this kind of huge monolith of, like some building with bricks, all right? But it isn't like that, actually. And the more we can kind of pull people away from it, I think the better.
Totally.
So thank you very much.
Totally with you. Thank you. And I'd love to talk to you afterwards and learn a bit from your methodology, how you did it.
Hi. Of the 62 billionaires, I'm wondering if there's any. What I've noticed amongst extremely competitive, greedy people is they're extremely competitive. And when they get to the top of the tree, they also can become competitive about giving it away. We see this time and time again in history. And I'm wondering is, because 62 is a number you can get your head around, and it's 6 degrees of separation to these people, would it be possible to highlight, to get them to compete to be the best at being peaceful? They've made enough money, right? It seems a simple idea, but why not?
Go for it.
What's the gender of those 62 people?
I don't know. You find out.
There are very few women, let's just put it that way. I just wanted to reiterate that it's really important, and it's been quite inspiring, because as I got here, every single person pretty much that you've mentioned and every single person that you've kind of talked about in the groups have been women so far, from what I've heard.
Henri in Congo is very much not a woman.
Well, there we go. I didn't hear that bit. I've got here a bit late, but I just wanted to say about how you said there's only like 2% or something, or what was
2.5% of the people
2.5%
at peace negotiations.
at the peace negotiations are women. And I think that that's important to remember in life as well. And again as well, the fact that wanting millennials on more of these kind of decision-making committees, because so many of the people making decisions for my life are going to die in 10 years or 20 years or so. And it's not fair that I have to live with the decision made by so many people who are like...
Fossils.
Well, no, because everybody deserves to make a decision and to have a choice. But I think that more respect should be given to young people as well who want to go into those positions.
And may I make a suggestion? to get what you're caring about and what you're passionate about to happen, it would be great if you could present the CVs and the abilities of people, women particularly, that you believe in, and present them where they should be on a committee or a council or a board.
Definitely.
Please do.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
You want to stop? One more. Sir.
We're told it might take 100 years to achieve peace and end conflict. May I remind us all that we haven't got 100 years to deal with climate change and all the associated environmental threats which are going to kick in and potentially destroy civilization as we know it, the world as we know it, in substantially less than 100 years.
Thank you. I absolutely agree. Ed?
Thanks. I want to really say thanks for coming and speaking to us. And I noticed that you put a lot of attention onto people listening to each other, and that seems very important to me. Something that strikes me is that we have a huge resource in ourselves that's really quite untapped about respectful listening and paying attention to each other, and that we can apply that all around us, and we can do that systematically with each other here. We can actually do that everywhere, and it's we are a massive resource in being able to kind of keep slowing down and listening to each other. And as an educator, somebody interested in learning, and as a person interested in therapy and healing, I think they're very similar. It's a resource that's important for both of those.
Absolutely.
And my experience is, in listening to people on the subject of racism, people offload all sorts of issues and, if you like, kind of froth before they start telling us what it is that really bothers them. So in that case of the problem solving around being about racist attitudes, behind it are upset, distressed people. And it chimes with what you're saying about making peace. So
what you're saying is absolutely important, and thank you for underlining it. The fastest way to resolve a conflict in a family or a boardroom is actually to listen to the person in detail and then feed back to them what you've heard. Say, did I get it right? And that helps to move, because you're then honing in on the feelings, as you just said, behind the diatribe. And that helps you move from the head, I'm right and you're wrong, to the heart, ooh, I begin to see how you feel. And that shifts everything. So thank you for saying what you just said.
Thank you. One more time for Scilla Elworthy. And she didn't mention her books are for sale down here. And talking about listening, there's a think shop just getting started on the garden stage, Clean Language and Developing Collective Trust, which is about listening. Coming up shortly on this stage, we'll be having a panel, Protest, Counterculture and the Role of Comedy and Satire. So take your pick and have a good day. Thanks very much.